keeping up with AI is like, well, it's less like staying informed and more like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah, it's a lot. Definitely a fast-paced field for sure.
And there's always something new coming out. Some big new AI model or something.
Right. But there are a lot of changes that are happening kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah, the stuff that doesn't necessarily make the headlines.
Exactly. But those changes are really important for the future of AI.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're looking at today.
Uh-huh.
This thing called the Model Context Protocol.
An MCP.
MCP.
Yeah.
From Anthropic.
This is something that most people probably haven't heard of.
Right.
But it has the potential to really change how we use AI.
Yeah, definitely. So in this deep dive, we're going to break down what MCP is and why it matters.
And we'll look at some of the initial reactions to it.
And think about what it could mean for the future.
Exactly.
So to prepare for this deep dive, we looked at a few different sources.
Okay.
Primarily discussions on the Claude AI subreddit.
Makes sense.
Yeah, they're pretty active over there.
Yeah.
We also looked at articles from tech blogs like DEV Community, Phil Schmid, Microsoft Tech Community, Modelmetry, Discope, Treble, and Tech Talks.
Those are all good sources.
Yeah, and of course we looked at the Model Context Protocol's GitHub repository.
Of course.
So let's jump in.
Okay.
So what exactly is this Model Context Protocol? What problem is it trying to solve?
So the main problem that MCP is trying to solve is this, it's how to connect AI models with all of the different data sources and tools that we have.
Right.
Like right now, if you have an AI model and you want it to work with, say, a database,
Yeah.
you have to build a custom integration for that specific AI model and that specific database.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of work.
It is. And it's not just databases either. It's also APIs for different services, file systems, communication platforms, all sorts of things.
And so you have to do that for every single AI model.
Potentially, yeah. If you want each model to be able to work with all of those things,
That sounds like a huge mess.
it can be.
Yeah.
It's a lot of duplicated effort and a lot of complexity.
Yeah, that reminds me of before we had USB.
Oh, yeah.
Like back in the day, you know, every single peripheral you bought for your computer needed its own port and its own driver.
Exactly.
My printer, my scanner, even my mouse.
Right.
It was a nightmare.
It was a tangled mess of cables.
So is MCP trying to be like the USB of AI?
That's a really good analogy.
Right.
Yeah, MCP is essentially trying to be like the USB-C of AI.
Okay.
It's a standardized way for AI applications to connect to all of those different data sources and tools.
So it's like a universal connector.
Exactly. And it's not just limited to Claude either.
Oh, really?
Yeah, potentially other AI models could use it too, like Gemini.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so how MCP actually works is it's based on a client-server architecture.
Okay.
So you have hosts, which are the AI applications that people interact with.
Like Claude Desktop?
Yeah, like Claude Desktop or an AI-powered IDE.
Okay.
Then you have clients, which are components within those hosts that manage the connections to MCP servers.
Got it.
And then you have the servers themselves.
Okay.
And these servers are standalone programs that expose specific capabilities through the MCP interface.
So the server is like the thing that actually does the work.
In a way, yeah. Like if you have an MCP server for a database,
Uh-huh.
that server would be responsible for actually accessing the database and retrieving the data.
Okay.
And what's really interesting about these servers is that you can build them using a lot of different programming languages.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like Python, TypeScript, Java, Rust, and more.
So that gives developers a lot of flexibility.
Exactly.
So you have the hosts, the clients, and the servers. But how do they actually communicate with each other?
Right, so the communication happens through what's called the transport layer.
The transport layer.
Yeah. And right now, for local connections, they can just use STDIO.
SDDIO.
Yeah, it's just standard input and output streams.
Okay.
But for remote connections,
Yeah.
it's currently using HTTP with SSE.
Server send events.
Yeah. But the plan is to eventually move to streamable HTTP. And all of the messages that they exchange are formatted using JSON RPC 2.0.
So that's how they all talk to each other.
Right.
Now, you mentioned that the servers expose these things called tools, resources, and prompts.
Right.
Can you explain what those are in a little more detail?
Sure. So tools are basically functions that the large language model itself can call.
Okay.
So if you think about function calling in other AI models, it's kind of like that.
So if I ask Claude to book a flight,
Right.
there might be a tool for that.
Exactly. There might be a flight booking API that's exposed as an MCP tool.
Oh.
And Claude can recognize that it needs to book a flight,
Yeah.
and then it can automatically call that tool.
Got it.
Resources, on the other hand, are more about providing data to the AI.
Okay.
So it's kind of like making a JIT2 request to an API.
Okay.
It allows the AI to retrieve information from different sources.
Like databases or files.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then prompts are predefined templates that help the AI use tool or resources more effectively.
Can you give an example?
Sure. So imagine you have a customer service API.
Yeah.
And you want to ask it for the status of an order.
Okay.
You could write a prompt that tells the AI exactly how to format that request.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so the AI doesn't have to figure it out on its own.
Right.
It just uses the prompt.
So basically, tools are for actions, resources are for data, and prompts are for instructions.
Exactly.
Got it.
So a send email function exposed by an email service would be a tool.
Okay.
Accessing a specific file in your Dropbox through an API would be a resource.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's try to put this all together.
Okay.
Say I'm using Claude Desktop, and I ask it to summarize the latest earnings report for Google.
Okay.
And that report is saved in my company's internal database.
Uh-huh.
How would MCP handle that request?
So first, Claude would analyze your request,
Uh-huh.
and it would realize that it needs to access data from an external source.
Well, earnings report in the database.
Huh? Right. And through MCP, it would know that there's probably a resource available for that.
Like a database connector.
Exactly.
Cool.
So the MCP client within Claude would then need to handle authentication and permissions.
To make sure it's allowed to access the database.
Right.
Got it.
And once it's authorized, the client would send a request to the database server.
In the MCP format.
Right. And it would specify which data it needs.
The earnings report.
Right. And then the database server would retrieve that report and send it back to the client.
And then Claude can summarize it for me.
Exactly.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a much more integrated and efficient way of doing things.
So taking a step back, why is this considered such a big deal?
Well, there are a lot of benefits to using MCP.
Like what?
Well, first of all, it standardizes the way that AI applications connect to external systems.
So instead of having to build a custom integration for every single pairing,
Right.
you just use MCP.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the standardization also leads to better performance. Oh, how so?
Because the AI can directly access the data and tools it needs,
Okay.
so it can respond faster and more accurately.
That makes sense.
There's also a lot more flexibility.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because if you want to switch to a different AI model in the future,
Huh?
you don't necessarily have to rewrite all of your integrations.
That's convenient.
It is. And MCP also makes it easier to manage context
Okay.
because it provides a consistent way to keep track of information across multiple interactions.
So the AI can remember what you've talked about before.
Exactly.
It's important.
It is. And security is another big benefit.
Okay.
Because MCP includes mechanisms for authentication and access control.
So you can make sure that the AI is only accessing the data it's supposed to.
Exactly.
That's reassuring.
It is, and it's only going to get better as MCP continues to evolve.
So it sounds like MCP is good for both developers and users.
Exactly.
It makes things easier and more secure.
Right.
And it also opens up a lot of new possibilities.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Like you were saying before about how MCP could be used to build more sophisticated AI agents.
Uh-huh.
Agents that can actually carry out complex tasks.
Right.
Like maybe an agent that can read my emails and then schedule meetings based on what it finds.
Exactly. That would be amazing.
Yeah, and that's something that MCP could enable.
So it's not just about retrieving information anymore.
Right,
It's
yeah.
about actually taking action.
Exactly. And that's a big shift.
It is.
And what's really interesting is that
Yeah.
MCP was designed with this kind of thing in mind.
So it's not just adapting an old model to a new use case.
Nope. It's built from the ground up with the unique needs of AI in mind.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
No, I was looking at the Claude AI subreddit when MCP was announced, and the reactions seemed kind of muted.
Yeah, you're right. It wasn't the overwhelmingly positive response that you might have expected.
Yeah. What do you think was going on there?
Well, I think some people were skeptical of the marketing language that Anthropic used.
Like they used a lot of buzzwords like game changer and seamlessly. And people were also looking for more technical details.
So they wanted to see how it actually worked.
Right. And some people thought that MCP might just be a rebranding of existing functionality.
Like tool use.
Exactly.
So they didn't see it as a big enough change.
Right. And there were also some questions about the open source aspect of MCP.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, some people felt like it wasn't truly open source.
Okay, so there was definitely some skepticism.
Yeah.
But were there any positive reactions?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, what were people saying?
Well, some people made comparisons to other successful standards like ODBC.
Open database connectivity.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they thought that MCP could have a similar impact on the AI world.
So it could unify the way that AI applications access data.
Right.
That would be huge.
It would. And some people also saw MCP as a way to standardize the way we build and integrate tools.
Okay.
Kind of like custom GPTs with API references.
Okay.
Yeah. And another key point that people brought up was that MCP is framework agnostic.
What does that mean?
It means that you can use it with any AI development framework.
Like LangChain or Smallagent?
Exactly.
Oh, okay, that's cool.
Yeah, and some people saw MCP as a way to simplify the connection to Claude desktop.
So it could make it easier to use Claude with local resources.
Right.
Okay.
And there was also this idea that MCP is Anthropic's NACS moment.
What does that mean?
Well, NACS is the North American charging standard.
For electric vehicles.
Right.
Okay.
And it's become the dominant standard in North America.
Yeah.
So some people think that MCP could become the dominant standard for tool calling in AI.
Interesting.
Yeah. And another interesting comment that I saw was that MCP is like the foundation for a multi-agent orchestration system.
So you could have multiple AI agents working together.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a really cool idea.
Yeah, and it's something that MCP could enable.
So all in all, it sounds like there were a lot of different perspectives on MCP.
Yeah, there were.
Some skepticism, but also a lot of excitement.
Exactly.
So what about adoption? Have people actually started using MCP?
Yeah, actually adoption has been growing steadily.
Really?
Yeah, Anthropic announced it in late 2024,
Uh-huh.
but it really started to pick up steam in early 2025.
That's great.
Yeah, and we're seeing a growing ecosystem of both clients and servers.
Okay, let's start with clients.
Mm.
What are some examples of MCP clients?
Well, obviously there's Claude Desktop,
Right.
but there are also a bunch of code editors and IDEs that have integrated support for MCP,
Like what?
like Cursor, Zed, Continue, and SourceGraph Cody.
Oh, wow. So it's already being used by some pretty popular tools.
Yeah, and there are also AI development frameworks that have adapters for MCP,
Like what?
like Firebase GenKit and LangChain.
Okay, so there are a lot of different ways to use MCP.
Yeah, there are.
What about servers?
Well, the MCP project itself maintains reference servers for some common systems,
Like what?
like PostgreSQL, Slack, and GitHub. And we're also seeing official integrations from companies like Stripe, JetBrains, and Amplify.
Those are all big names.
They are.
And what about community contributions?
Yeah, there are a bunch of those too.
What?
Like servers for Discord, Docker, and HubSpot.
So it's a really active community.
Yeah, it is. And one of the biggest developments recently is that OpenAI announced support for MCP.
Wow, really?
Yeah,
That's a pretty big deal.
it is. It's a major validation of the standard.
So why do you think MCP is gaining so much traction?
Well, I think there are a few reasons.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first of all, it's AI native,
Maybe.
meaning that it was specifically designed for AI.
Okay.
It's not just an old standard that's been adapted.
Right.
It's built from the ground up with the needs of AI agents in mind.
So it's more efficient and effective.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, it's also an open standard, meaning that the specification is publicly available,
Okay,
and anyone can use it.
that's important.
It is, and it builds on proven foundation,
Like what?
like the language server protocol and JSON RPC 2.0.
Okay.
And Anthropic has been really good about providing support and documentation.
So it's easy for developers to get started with.
Exactly.
And then there's the network effect.
Right.
The more people use it, the more valuable it becomes.
Exactly.
So it's a really positive feedback loop.
It is.
So what's next for MCP? Are there any planned improvements?
Yeah, there are a lot of exciting things on the horizon.
Like what?
Well, security is a big focus.
Okay.
They're going to be mandating OAuth 2.1 for remote HTTP servers.
To make sure the connections are secure.
Right.
Got it.
And they're also working on improving the efficiency of the protocol.
Right.
They're going to be moving to streamable HTTP and adding support for JSON RPC batching.
So it'll be faster and more responsive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, they're also adding new tool annotations.
What are those?
They're basically metadata about the tools
Okay.
so the AI can understand them better. And they're also working on an official MCP server registry.
So it'll be easier to find the tools and resources you need.
Right.
That's great.
Yeah, and they're also exploring some more advanced features,
Like what?
like sampling capabilities for AI to AI collaboration.
So multiple AIs could work together on a task.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah. And they're also formalizing the authorizations specification.
So it'll be even more secure.
Right.
So it sounds like MCP is still evolving,
It is.
but it's already a very powerful and promising technology.
Definitely.
But of course, no technology is perfect.
True.
So what are some of the limitations of MCP?
Well, it's still a relatively new technology.
So it hasn't been widely adopted yet,
Right.
and that means that there might not be a lot of support available?
Yeah, that's something to keep in mind.
Okay, what else?
Well, security is always a concern.
Especially when you're dealing with sensitive data.
Exactly.
So you have to be careful about how you implement MCP. And the effectiveness of MCP also depends on the underlying AI models. If the AI models aren't very good,
Yeah.
then MCP won't be able to do much.
Right. And scalability is another potential issue.
What do you mean?
Well, if a lot of people start using MCP,
Uh-huh.
it could put a strain on the servers,
So it might slow things down?
potentially.
Yeah.
Okay, what else?
Well, transitioning to MCP can also be a challenge for organizations that already have a lot of custom integrations.
Because they have to rewrite everything.
Potentially.
And the standardization of MCP could also be a limitation in some cases.
How so?
Well, if you need a very specialized or customized solution,
Uh-huh.
MCP might not be flexible enough.
That's a good point.
And then there's always the uncertainty of how the standard will evolve in the future.
Right.
So those are all things to keep in mind.
Yeah.
But overall, MCP seems like a very positive development.
Okay, go.
It has the potential to really change the way we use AI.
Definitely.
So to wrap things up, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? Well, I think the main takeaway is that MCP is a powerful tool that can make AI more useful and accessible.
Okay.
It streamlines the way that AI applications connect to external systems. And it opens up a lot of new possibilities for what AI can do.
So it's something that everyone should be aware of,
Definitely.
especially if you're interested in the future of AI.
Exactly.
Because MCP could play a big role in shaping that future.
I think so.
It could make AI more integrated into our lives.
Right.
And it could enable AI to do things that we can't even imagine right now.
It's an exciting time to be following AI.
It is. So to leave our listeners with something to think about,
Okay.
imagine a world where AI can seamlessly access and interact with all of your digital tools and data. Your email, your calendar, your project management software, your cloud storage, everything.
That would be amazing.
It would. What new possibilities would that unlock for you?
Yeah. What could you do with that kind of power?
And what challenges might it create?
Yeah, that's an important question to consider.
It is. So think about which data sources and tools you would want an AI assistant to connect to.
And what kind of workflows you could create with that.
It's a really interesting thought experiment.
It is. And if you want to learn more about MCP,
Yeah.
you can check out the official website and the GitHub repository.
Those are great resources.
Yeah.
And that's it for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.